Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Half a Thought. And this time I have with me Salman Ansari. And Salman is a friend of mine, essentially a Twitter friend or an internet friend. And I happened to just reach Salman's feed through some measure. I guess it was David Perel's feed, and Salman had written something on that. And then I scrolled through a few tweets of his, and some of them really struck me. So I hit him a follow button. And then after a few weeks, I reached out to Salman saying that, hey, would you be down to give me some feedback on my newsletter? And he very kindly just made basically a Loom screen recording and a video, a 7 to 8 minute video, basically just critiquing my newsletter and giving me some solid feedback. So I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. And then we connected, and then we talked about writing. I asked for some advice, and it was just great. So I was like, might as well just have Salman on the podcast and learn a lot. So very quickly, just to introduce Salman to everyone, Salman thinks of himself as like a polymath. And he is a startup founder, CTO, web developer, iOS developer, engineering manager, learner, and above all, something that really struck me was writer. Because then it's like, although I know that the left brain and the right brain divide does not exist, but the writer and the engineer part really exists in Salman's sort of skill set and learning abilities. And he has this Quick Brown Fox, which is a newsletter that I read very often. And it's like a sweet little newsletter that comes every week and just gives you some snippets of life advice, which is just awesome. And he's really active on Twitter. And I really, really encourage for anyone who's our age or anyone just looking to learn in general to just follow Salman and read about his philosophy. So Salman, I guess I'll just start with just asking you, you've been all over the place. And I say that positively, not in negative context. So I'd love to know what your story is, what got you here, and how are you doing?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks for having me. It's great to finally connect and chat. Very, very kind of you to say. Yeah, I think I'll try and keep it short. I have spent a really long time in the startup world. Over a decade. Is the first the first startup I joined was I was the first employee with a couple of friends, and kind of went through the path of being an engineer and building a lot of core infrastructure for this product that we were working on, and into a management role. And we were kind of acquired to Oracle later. And so I learned a lot about sort of how you build companies and how you build great products, and kind of the hustle and the grind was very evident there. I ended up doing another startup where I was the founder CTO. It was called Rested. We were basically trying to help people who have sleep apnea to get treatment. It takes them a really long time. It's very difficult. So I worked on that for a couple of years, and I kind of came out of that experience pretty burned out. I think I had realized, like, maybe in over 11 years, I just kind of was just working nonstop. I never really took an extended break of any kind. And so I kind of, decided, okay, well, I'll take a quick break, maybe a few months, and kind of go travel a bit. And that sort of led into this like 6 to 8 month long thing, which I really didn't expect. And I went in all kinds of directions there, where I really just started to ask a lot of questions. I would say that's the best way to summarize it. Kind of like, why are we really doing this? I discovered meditation. I discovered a lot of different areas. After that, I kind of still didn't have many answers. And so I worked at Facebook for a year and a half or so. And most recently now, what I'm doing is kind of a mix of part-time work with a startup, as well as the writing. And I do a lot of illustration and animation. And so I would really call
I
it,
keep on seeing that on Twitter.
yeah,
Keeps
yeah. I
on
mean,
posting.
it's something I've wanted to do for a really long time, and it's really fun. And I kind of would call it like an experiment. I'm trying to embrace these ideals of, like, here, mix all these different skills and sort of pursue your curiosities. But and seeing, like, how can I build a life for myself where I just get to sort of learn about things that I like, and do things that I like, and kind of, and that is somehow like my work. Which is,
Wow.
it's, if I just think about, like, if I actually pulled that off, that would be pretty amazing. So I might as well try it. I think that's the thing that's been most difficult for me, and it's probably the case with a lot of people who are very productive, very successful. Just all these people I know, it's like you have a hard time giving yourself permission to do things like that. So that's what I'm working on. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
So I'm curious, because you mentioned that you worked on a bunch of startups. even had your own startup,
Yep.
and you founded it for like 10 to 11 years, and you worked for all of these years. What was like the last straw on the camel's back, and what essentially dawned upon you that made you walk this path of this self-realization, if I can call
Yeah.
it that?
Yeah, I think like my first startup, I was actually employee number one. I wasn't a founder on it, and that's the one that kind of lasted almost, if you count the years I spent after we were acquired, a few more years. I would say that that was a long grind where I was pretty young and I was still learning a lot. And I think, when you're in that phase, you really do make a lot of sacrifices, and it makes sense to do that because you're trying to build something out of your career. You're trying to give yourself like a foundation. And so I think in that sense, it was good. What happened sort of after that is I kind of went and founded a company, I guess because I thought I should, like, I was kind of like, well, I was employee number one, and a lot of people tell me like, I was doing well in leadership and all these things, so it just makes sense.
Was the startup successful, or did it
No,
go
the second
somewhere?
one was not. No, I mean, we were successful in some ways where we were able to actually we built. So the problem we were working on was basically right now, if you have this condition called sleep apnea, you basically, it causes you to have problems while you're asleep where you don't breathe properly, and it's very difficult to know that you have problems, and it's very difficult to get treatment. And so some people can take like years before they actually get treatment. So we had built this like end-to-end solution where you actually could use a phone app that you would install, and it would kind of look at your sleep and then tell you like, hey, I think you're at risk. And then you could click a button and talk to a doctor over video. And then you could order the treatment and get it straight to your house. And so we would take like a 1-2 year process to like 4 to 6 weeks. So we were successful in that we created that. It existed, but it was very complex. I think building anything in healthcare is generally very complex, but we couldn't really get enough people to go through the whole process. Just sort of the demand wasn't quite as high. Like even people who really had this problem, they would just be like, yeah, I don't know, this machine's kind of weird. I don't really want to use it. And which really surprised me. I really thought that, if you have this general health problem, like you'd be interested in it. But, we took on a few too many things, I think. And there were other, there were other factors at play that I can go into, but it's a startup sort of struggle, and we kind of had to shut the company after a couple of years, and I had it had also personally burnt me out because of some of those components. And so I think one of the things that I think is interesting is that sometimes I look back and I think if it hadn't played out that way, where there weren't a bunch of these conditions that really took a toll on me, I may have just sort of kept going and just sort of founded another company and another one and another one. And I think that does tend to happen a lot of times is you don't really have a force function to stop and evaluate why you're doing anything. It's actually quite difficult to find that force function. And so, that pain and sort of difficulty and emotional turmoil or whatever you want to call it, I look back now and I'm like, oh, thank God. Oh, thank God. Like I really struggled and was, in a lot of pain, because otherwise I wouldn't have given myself the space to make those, to ask those questions and to just sort of explore. Now, at the same time, there's like a wealth of privilege that I had that I could take a bunch of time off, and so I try to be really mindful of that and to take advantage of that privilege as much as possible. Like it gave me an insight. I really did start to, I got into meditation, as I mentioned, where I was meditating for an hour every day. And now I don't meditate for an hour every day, but when you really push yourself into those questions, then you learn something and then they serve as reference points. So, I would say, pain kind of took me there, and I'm glad that it did.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're saying about, not having the purpose of doing a startup because you mentioned that you did
Yep,
not know
that's right.
why to do a startup just because you were employee number one. It reminds me of that article that Mark Andreessen wrote here on his blog. And the very first article is why you should not do a startup.
You're
And
right.
he tries to delineate all the reasons, is that it is
Yeah.
an emotional roller coaster ride and a bunch of other things. And that
Yeah.
really got me thinking about, I guess it reminds me of what Nietzsche said. He who has a why can almost bear anyhow.
True.
So
True.
it's just
Absolutely.
that in
Yeah.
your
And
case.
yeah, I think, it can be really complicated too, where like, I had been doing a lot of work. My first startup was in the sort of marketing space. And so my thinking was, hey, I'm going to do something in healthcare because I can really help people. I had done a lot of teaching right after the previous startup, and I really enjoyed teaching. I found like just connecting with people and helping them was like probably the most rewarding work I've ever done, actually. I don't think I've ever really felt as proud of anything, including like the startup inquiry or anything like that, than just teaching people and having them tell you like, hey, these things that you said or this way that you taught like just made me different and changed my life a little bit. And I still remember like every word. So I kind of took that and I was like, oh, well, I should try and find a way to, to help people through like startups. And so there was some like driving force, and that's actually what helped me stay on even 2 years. I know it doesn't sound like a long time, but it's a long time in the startup world. So much happens, even in a couple of months. And so I would just keep going back to like, well, there's people who are literally like, they can't breathe at night, and they're, it puts them at risk in heart disease. And these are the people, and I'm trying to help them. And that's what's driving me. So I do think you're absolutely right that like, you do have to find the why, but you also have to find the why in terms of like, why are you doing this particular thing? Like what else could you possibly be doing that is as fulfilling as you? Like, just because you're helping people doesn't necessarily mean it's the way that you need to help people.
Yeah.
Another thing I would say the biggest one for me is like, a lot of people told me that I should found a startup because I had the right like skill sets, and and so it's rare. So it's just like with management, like it's pretty rare to have people who are, and so they kind of suggest that you become manager. But I actually don't remember where I read it, but you really don't necessarily have to be doing stuff that just because you're good at them, right? Like you kind of want to do stuff that you're good at, but also gives you energy.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think you're implicitly referring to the Japanese concept of Ikigai, which is
right.
what you're good at, what society will pay you for, and the
Exactly.
intersection of the bunch of
Exactly.
circles.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's a diagram for that, right? Like that's
Yeah, yeah.
a beautiful
There is
diagram.
a flower diagram, then there is the circle diagram, and
Right.
I keep on referring to it every now and
Right.
then.
Yeah. Like the theme that I always go back to is energy. So
Yeah,
like, everyone tells you to talk about or focus on like, okay, how much time do you have in your day and how do you use your time? Don't waste your time. We don't have time. Let's hurry up. We're running out of time. Like everything's around time. But really, like, if you think about it, like energy is the factor that can change all of that. So for example, if you're working on something that you just really enjoy and it gives you energy, time is meaningless. It doesn't matter.
yeah.
You could do it for like 4 hours. You'd be like, what? Oh, I didn't realize.
You're in a state of flow then, so you
You're in a
don't
state
really
of flow,
keep track
right?
of time.
On the flip side, if you're doing something, you may be good at it, but you just don't, your heart isn't in it. Like 15 minutes can just feel like, oh my God, like, and so it's really important to think about that. And so I try and think about that as much as possible, like literally
Yeah.
throughout the day, anything that happens, I don't know, I've started to develop this like sense I can feel my head gets a little heavy sometimes when I
Okay.
am doing something that I'm like, oh, interesting. I guess there's something about this that isn't, I don't know. I should explore that. Or the flip side where you do something. I think all of us have those moments where you just do something and you're like, oh, I need to do more of this. Like
Yeah.
this. So I try to use that as a guide as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that really makes sense. And what that sort of links back me to is, and I'll take the conversation forward by talking about skill sets because you mentioned that how you were told by your friends to just do a startup. But before I move on, I guess one clarification question that I really have is, I remember that when you were critiquing my newsletter and giving me feedback, you told me that it's not that you have to be productive 24/7, because that is a really stressful thing.
Yeah.
And that links back very well to this concept of energy and what makes you happy and what keeps you going, and the lack of sort of time. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, when you talk about productivity and when you talk about pursuing your passion in a way.
Yeah.
I remember reading from one of the sources that it's not about pursuing your passion. In fact, follow your passion is a myth.
Yeah.
You should do something that is inherently hard, and passion comes from doing something that is hard, challenging, and by the flow state is 10% harder than your existing skill set. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a really good and interesting area. It's a really good point and really interesting area. Firstly, I would say I think we have to be careful not to draw conclusions around like what is the right approach, right? Because there is no right approach. There is an approach that makes sense for you. So before I answer, like go into specifically what you were saying, here's an example. Some people will say, you should work on your own stuff. Stop working for other people, right? And like, it's a great soundbite. Like, it sounds amazing, like, of course you should work on your own stuff, invest in yourself, stop working for the man or what have you. But like, I don't know. Anytime I see these like quips that just sort of like share something like that, I know that they're not actually recognizing the nuance of decisions like that. So for example, I just think it's important, going back to what you said earlier, to know why you are working on something. So I'll give you an example. Like when I was working at certain points in my career, I was working because I wanted to build up a financial sort of like stable sort of resource that I could then go and just do stuff with far less financial pressure, right? So you may be working somewhere to kind of enable that. And in that sense, you're working on your passion. It's just a future investment, right? So that's one thing I would say, because I think it comes up a lot when people are like, should I work for a big company or should I work for a startup? Should I do my own thing?
Exactly. I think that's one of the most
It's
common
like,
questions.
whatever you're doing, just make sure you understand like why you're doing it and what it makes sense. It may be an investment in your future. Now, as for your other point about like, you shouldn't just work on things you like, you should work on like hard problems that kind of push you further. I think there's some truth to like, you shouldn't just, here's what I've taken out of that resonates with me, is that not every hobby needs to become a job. So one of the things, and so we kind of giggle, but like, a lot of times this happens, like you're working at some job, right? And you're like, yeah, my job's fine, whatever. But you come home or on the weekend, you do some sort of creative hobby, right? And you're like, wow, this is so fun. Like, this is great. I should just do this for life. And it's like, be careful, like probably not actually. Like you probably, like, first of all, here's why. Here's a couple of things. Like, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but you shouldn't conclude that you should right away. So there's a couple of things. Number one, like hobbies are a gift. Like hobbies are a beautiful thing where you get to go and make something. No one has any expectations of you. No one is putting anything on you. They're just, you get to go and make it and it's yours. And no one can take that from you. What an amazing thing. So you should not underestimate the value of that on its own. You should not attach labels of like, maybe this is my job that in the future. And so that's how I would interpret the thing of like, don't just do your passion, right? So, you might say like, well, I tend to really do a lot of this. And I also happen to be fairly good at that. And I've noticed that there's a fair amount of demand for that, going back to the Ikigai thing, right? Then maybe there's something there and then you can pursue that, but it's probably going to be a much more difficult rendition of that. It's not going to be the weekend project version of it. It's going to be the like much more ambitious sort of overarching vision of how you can take that skill set and bring something new. So I have another thought on that, but I'm gonna pause there.
Yeah, I think that really makes sense, and it beautifully links and segues into, Tim Ferriss recently released this video on being a generalist versus being a specialist. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the Scott Adams philosophy of either you combine two valuable skills and you're in the top 25% of those, or you're really, really good at, say, basketball or one particular skill. And what you just said essentially just ratifies that in a way, because you are trying to find a confluence of many different skill sets that you have. But at the same time, I wonder that the market, and I'm strictly talking about it in economic quantifiable objective terms,
Yep.
the market tends to reward measurable, specific skill sets, whether you know Java, Node.js,
Yep.
Python, and specific skills. But
Yep.
the market does not reward a confluence of these skills.
Yes.
And therefore, tracking back from that, I wonder if there is an inherent value in pursuing this path, not saying that this is a path, but I'm just curious about that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the way that I tend to think, so first of all, I love the story of Scott Adams. I love the sort of metaphor, and it's something that I'm personally exploring and trying to, and I should emphasize, like, I would call it what I'm doing like an experiment, because I want to learn and see, like, okay, everything I've done so far is not in this approach, right? So I think you're right though. Like one of the things I would say is, like, I feel comfortable trying to pursue a more disparate set of skills because I have a really strong foundation. Like, I did engineer, just being an engineer, and I still actually do it as a part-time thing, like, for over a decade. Like, it's a really long time to just, work on a craft. And so I do think you want to do that. And there's a number of reasons why, like, even if you end up doing something else, it gives you a lot of confidence, and it gives you credibility, and it gives you experience in terms of understanding how to persevere through the thick and the thin
Yeah.
of working on stuff. So I think that's important. I do think that society in general, driven by industry, does tend to reward specialization, right?
Yeah.
I think, especially when you look at these big companies, there just isn't really room for someone who's like, I do all these different things. It's like, listen, that's cool, but we really just need someone that does this thing.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean? That means that if you really want to figure out some kind of niche for yourself that mixes these, it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
So you definitely wouldn't do it because it's easy. You would do it because you just can't see yourself doing anything else, or you just can't see yourself not doing, these parts of you that you're seeing coming out. I think that I wouldn't say that I like you said, at the beginning, like, I've held a lot of different roles. Like, I've gone from like engineer to manager to founder, and I'm writing and I'm like drawing. It's, like, there's a lot of popular advice that's like, yeah, that's confusing. Like, just
Yeah.
like, no, can you just pick a thing? Like,
Because I guess the question is, then how do you really achieve greatness? Steve Jobs never, like, wrote and drew like this and
yeah.
did that and all of that. And I wonder, because I also tend to identify with doing multiple things, I wonder if it's an easy way to mediocrity.
Yeah.
And I'm trying
That's
to
a good
critique
question.
myself.
No, this is a very important question. So the question is actually, what's your goal? So, like, if greatness in a definition that, and there's actually a bunch of implicit assumptions of what greatness means, but some of those assumptions are tagged like that. I'll relate. Greatness means you're widely known. Greatness means you are widely respected, probably for a specific thing.
Yeah.
Greatness means you now have privileges of this notoriety and probably wealth. But if nothing else, like a very strong achievement in one particular area. These are all really important things to aspire to. I definitely wouldn't say I've like achieved greatness, but I felt like, hey, I worked really hard on one approach of working, which is, building startups and writing code. And, one of our startups was acquired. I had some success in that. I felt a reasonable amount of contentment from that. And so for me, I guess I'm not necessarily striving to achieve that. I'm more like for me, I guess here's another way to think about it. Like, okay, you've achieved the greatness and now you have a bunch of money, which gives you the freedom. What are you going to do now? Well, now I'll just sort of like, just sort of pseudo retire and like just do whatever. I'll work on this, and, I always enjoyed so-and-so, so I'll do that. It's like, okay, what if you can figure out a way to do it right now? So that's kind of like the approach that I would say. And I think, it, for example, it would be very hard for me to do this if I just graduated or if I just started my career. Like, you really do want to build foundations first in something. And I think, you pointed out when Tim Ferriss talks about it, they talk about two. It's an interesting number because I've thought about it as like, what's the number? Like, how many things do you need as your primaries, right? Because yeah, once you start trying to mix like 7 things, like, yeah, it's pretty confusing. Like, I don't, you're just not really going to be very good at any one of them.
Yeah.
Um, so I do think going, sort of to circle back, I think you want to work off of a foundational skill, a primary one, and use that to then accent with some of these other skills. So like, I would say drawing for me is an accent skill. Like, I'm getting fairly good at it, but I mean, to be really good at it, like, I would just need another lifetime to
Yeah.
just work on that. And it's fun for me. So it kind of adds color and it adds interest and it adds sort of personality to things. So that's how I see it. Writing is an interesting one because I don't know. I mean, I feel like it doesn't fall under those categories. I feel like writing is something everyone really could do. And so, it really depends on how to categorize those things. But I do think all the technical skills, all the development skills, engineering skills, startup product skills, I think there's some foundation there. And I'm now starting to think about like how to take some of these other pieces and accent them. So yeah, one of the ideas that I'm kind of just toying with, it's pretty early stages, is I do believe that there's a lot of really talented developers who are somewhat limited by lack of strong communication skills, lack of like a foundation in design, lack of an understanding of basic psychology around like empathizing with other people and sort of understanding their needs. And there's sort of this mini list of those things. And those are the things that I've really like doubled down on. And that's what made me not just sort of the straight arrow engineer. So I was never like the most technical, super, super focused engineer. I was the engineer who did a bunch of these other things. And that actually gave me a lot of leverage in a lot of different situations. And so I think it would be cool if more people had that. So I'm trying to figure out like, okay, how can I package that into something that would help developers like go to that next level? Because you don't have to take like arts degrees and psychology degrees and communication degrees. You just need, I think with the term, like just enough to be dangerous.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of where my head's at there.
I think you need to be functionally capable to communicate and get your point across. And as long as you can do that, you're considered to have a good enough communication skill set.
That's right.
I think that's an awesome way to look at it. First develop it's again a ratification of what is commonly just understood, but this is looking at it from a different perspective. If you define greatness and you sort of and those are great things to aspire for, but if you backtrack and then you question whether you can really achieve greatness from a bunch of 7 things that you can, well, turns out that it's not practically possible, because to be a really good artist, to be the creator of Dilbert, you essentially have to have another lifetime, which you don't. So you need to optimize for 1 or 2 specific skill sets, and based off of that, you can accent that with a bunch of other things. Do you think that those skill sets that are core or fundamental are and have to be something to do with be able to build stuff? Because you mentioned technical skills or product skills.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether rigorous, and by technical, I don't just mean computer science skills. I also mean, say, math or statistics or any other of those sort of backgrounds. Do you think those are equally helpful or valuable?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we're talking about choices that people can make to be sort of makers of things, or, I think there's another angle where you can be someone that is researching, condensing knowledge and articulating it. And in that scenario, having a deep understanding of the mathematics behind how some of these things work, or the psychology behind it, or what have you. Some of the most successful writers and sort of multi-hat people I see are PhDs who have figured out that the most valuable thing they can do is take all of that sort of intensely complex knowledge and make it digestible for people. I do want to actually go back to one thing you just said, which was like you would need another lifetime to draw Dilbert. I actually think Dilbert is a really good example that's worth talking about for a second. So specifically, I don't think you need another lifetime to draw Dilbert. So here's why. So like, if you look at like his life story, like basically he was working in, in technology sector for a really long time. and he wasn't going to be a founder of the next Microsoft. Like, he was good, did well, but he was kind of, so that was, I guess you would call his foundational thing. Now he notes, like, he also sort of did some chicken scratch, as he described it, like just drew a little bit. They're not particularly good, but like, he's never going to be an artist, but he can do kind of some stuff there. He would make jokes in the office, like, here and there. He's not going to quit his job and be a comedian, but he's got some jokes. And so Dilbert is actually a deep foundational understanding of that industry and that world and everything that goes on. And that's what Dilbert is. And then it just so happens that he does some drawings, and it just so happens that there's a little bit of humor and jokes infused in there. So I think, like, that's the way that I always look at that example as, like, oh yeah, so there is this whole foundation of experience that I have and in startups and in technology. And that was really important for me. I only call that out because when I was getting into drawing and writing, I was like, oh God, does that mean I have to throw away everything else I did? Which is quite a depressing prospect. Like,
Yeah.
all that work and effort was pointless because now you're doing this. It's like, no, that's a part of you. That's like a piece of you that you need to figure out how to leverage. And then you can just learn these small other skills and then figure out ways to share that. So I feel like that's usually, like, Dilbert would not be great unless he had all of that experience and actually understood what was going on, right?
Yeah. I think I sort of follow that, and I'm trying to understand the main point from that you're trying to convey.
Yeah, so basically what I would say is, like, you can still take these new skills very quickly and create something completely differentiated from all of the others.
Got it.
I don't think it takes that much time. Like, I really don't. Like, so a lot of,
Yeah.
like, one example is just some folks, if you like, well, let's talk about this because we like talking about reading blog posts. For example, you read a blog post and you just see a visual in it, right? Like, a simple visual, it makes a huge difference. But it doesn't really take that much to just figure out how to, like, draw some lines and basically communicate that. So I think that's a good example of, like, yeah, you're learning how to draw, I guess, but you don't have to learn how to, like, draw. You just have to, just a little bit there, but it makes a huge difference. And I think in particular, because we have a very competitive field in a lot of these areas, like, if you're an engineer and you're trying to be unique, like, it's pretty hard. Like, there's so many people out there, and like, I think it's harder to go and be like, I'm going to be the best engineer.
Oh
Like,
yeah, totally.
like
It's
that's
impossible.
that's almost impossible,
Yeah.
right? Like the people that you're competing with, that with that scale, it's like they basically live and breathe code. And if that's interesting and that's what you want to do, then that's the right thing to do. But
Yeah.
otherwise, you can be like, I'll just do this other thing. Like, you're here doing these podcasts and you're creating a lot of awareness and sharing all your skill sets. And so I think it's in stuff like this that that I see what I describe polymath. Like, it's basically, like, I don't know how to articulate it, but I think it's like you've got the core nucleus, right? And
Yeah.
then you've got these
Yeah.
little pieces just sort of like making it interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful sort of exposition of what skills to pursue and how you should pursue them and what frameworks you should implicitly have before you sort of set out on the specialist path or this generalist or polymath kind of path. A follow-up question to that, and then I'll definitely move on to the last section, which is about writing and about just about some life advice, which we'll get to. But
Sure.
just to follow up question on the point of skills, I wonder if you think that, I mean, at the end of the day, Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, became lucky because he was doing all these things on the side, and then something just happened to take off.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
I'm curious, and we also know of other stories, other startup stories, which have just succeeded just off chance.
Totally.
And I'm curious whether you think that success is a confluence and equal weightage could be given to relationships and skills and luck, or how would you define your
Yes.
equation of
Yeah,
success?
actually, those are The three, that's pretty much the three that I would talk about most. So I don't know if you listened to the podcast, How I Built This.
I've listened
But
to one or two episodes, but I don't
yeah, but
quite
at the
remember.
end, it's kind of cool. At the end, he asks every founder he's interviewed, how much of your success would you attribute to your own hard work versus luck? And it's a really interesting question. I think hearing all the different answers, but what, is interesting. One of the things you'll hear is most people attribute luck like 50-50, which
Wow.
is a lot higher than you would think. But I definitely think it's true. I think, when I look back at a lot of the experiences we had, like, yeah, any point the company, that the first startup they were at, like, probably, it could have died. It definitely could have. You go through these ups and downs, and then, yeah, somehow we managed to get it acquired. And there would be times where I would give a talk maybe on some lessons, and I would be sitting there and I'd be like, if it wasn't acquired, they wouldn't have me here. But I would have still done all the same work, learned all the same lessons. That seems kind of silly, but that's life, that's the way that it works. So I do think luck is a big factor. And so what it just means is, like, recognizing that, okay, so I think there's something a little profound within luck. So, like, a lot of people are just like, oh, luck, that means it's luck, whatever. But luck represents what we can't control. Luck
Yeah.
represents unknown, uncertainty outside of our locus of control. So that means that if you're doing anything where you're creating and you're taking risk, you have to embrace that a large percentage, you can argue what the number is, 50, 20, it doesn't matter, right? It's some percentage. It's completely out of your control. That's pretty difficult to accept for a lot of us. Like, we want to plan out our day. We want to project out our revenues. We want to, all these types of things. And it can be very difficult to accept that, well, it doesn't matter. Like, this happens, done. Like, some people had all kinds of plans for 2020. Here we are,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so that's what I would say to that. The other thing that you mentioned was relationships, which I'm really glad you said that, because, when I joined that first startup, I actually we were it was a social media marketing startup, the first one we did. And I actually didn't really know anything about that space. I was just graduating from, I went to school in Waterloo in Canada. And I had done an internship where I met a couple of people, and they were like, hey, you should come and join this company. And I didn't know anything about the space, but I knew them. They were two of my best friends. I trusted them. And
Yeah.
I told myself, like, hey, I'm going to invest in people. I think it's going to work out, and I took a big bet to just trust them. And the big part of that worked out. And ever since then, I've kind of tried to remind myself of that. And I found, like, when I forget it, I do pay for it. And when I remember it, I get rewarded for it. So I think relationships are a big one. What I would say, though, is I was lucky that at least I had those friends to kind of give me that opportunity. But one of the things that I did, like, I was working so hard for so many years that I never, like, went and met anyone really. I never really expanded my network. So I remember looking back and being like, wow, I did some great work and no one knows except the people that work there, really. Which is kind of not a place you want to be after working on something for like 7-8 years, right? So I would say that's one thing, is because that's important, you want to, like, branch out your network, right? And so now we're I'm sure you've shared some great tips on this, doing stuff like this podcast, being active on Twitter, trying to create as many opportunities to meet these people who can just, like, change your life, right? So it's basically, you're doing all this to, like, maximize serendipity, to, like,
Yeah.
increase the chance that the luck just tips a tiny bit in your favor,
That's
right?
exactly the motivation. I mean,
Right.
I don't have an end goal of doing this, but it's just that doing this allows me to meet interesting people like you,
Yeah.
learn so much, and just sort of chart my own life path
Yeah.
according to it.
Yeah. I think there's a fourth angle which I'm starting to explore now. So I'm not sharing it as, like, oh, this is the thing to do, but it's an interesting question. Is, like, what if we just did this? So, like, I'm having fun. Like, this is a fun
Yeah.
conversation. That's enough. Like basically, if there was no impact on my luck and no investment in my body of work and no creation of my content, whatever, and it was just me and you just talking, like, why isn't that enough?
Yeah.
Maybe it is enough. And so, like, one of the things I'm thinking about with, like, my writing and my newsletter is, this goes back to some of the learnings from Liz Gilbert. Like, she talks about just working on stuff that you really pursuing your curiosities, pursuing your enthusiasm, like making sure you're having fun as you're doing it. And what's going to happen is some people are going to follow you, and then they're going to be like, I don't know what this is. And they're going to peace out. And you're like, great. Like, that's great. I'm really happy that, you removed me as a distraction, but somebody else will join, or maybe they won't. And you kind of like have to have this faith, I guess, that eventually, as you keep doing that, it will create something unique, and it may take a really long time. Like she notes, sometimes it takes years for you to do a bunch of weird things that you like. And then bam, like, you have to be kind of set up and ready for that with your machine. So I think that's something that I'm interested in, like doing more of. Like, so, I wrote this essay just last week, and I got a lot of great feedback. And I was like, okay, normally what I would do is I would say, what is the feedback? What did they like about it? I'll do more of that. But I had to be like, no, I'm just going to keep doing whatever I'm doing, because actually I think at the core level, like no one wants you to pander to them. Like no one wants you to just write like, or okay, here's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking as we talk.
Yeah.
I think there's like you as a human, and then there's products. Like for products, like we want to research them. We want to tailor them to users' needs. We want them to be like usable and functional. And so any feedback we get, we want to input. And then there's like you as a human. Like, and so what we do a lot of times, and what we're doing right now, is like we productize ourselves, right? We put ourselves out there. And
Exactly.
so then we turn on the same tactics. Oh, someone said they like this. I should implement more features in myself of that. And, someone didn't like this, so we should delete that feature from myself. And it's like, no, wait, I'm a human though. I shouldn't be treating myself this way. I should just do what I'm doing and just be authentic about it. And if people like it, they'll like it. And if they don't, they don't. Because then by the end, you'll have, like, I think this is what happens is some people find themselves, they've created their own dream of like, they're YouTubing and they're creating content, but they're creating content for their audience. They don't even really like it anymore, and they're stuck. And that's my like, I don't want that. I'm afraid of that. And so I just kind of thinking out loud, I think it's interesting to be like, you kind of have to just keep doing what you think is cool and just hoping that it works out. But if you have fun the whole time, then it's worth it. That's worth it.
I think it really takes me back to the paradox of success. I'm reading this book called Essentialism by Craig McQueen, and he says that the paradox of success is that what made you successful in the first place, once you are successful, you stop doing that, because then you productize yourself.
Right.
You add all these features.
Right.
It's the next feature fallacy. Like, oh, if I just add this one more feature, I think I'm sorted. I think I'm right. That's not how it works.
Right. Yeah. I think there's definitely something there to like what you're saying about what changes over time as you start to grow. So it's a fun experiment, but
that's a good question to sort of play around with, questioning the very premise of whether you even want to have an impact in the world. If you're just having fun, why not? Why is that not enough?
I think there is one tie to that, which is that if you are having fun and you're being authentic, like, and you're basically pursuing that rewarding sort of vulnerability or sharing with others, you will have a positive impact. So I would say, like, you're kind of having faith that there's this roundabout way that you're going to have positive influence.
Wow.
But when people experience it, I think, Liz Gilbo, she shared this example of this nun who basically has devoted her entire life to helping people who are essentially on their deathbed. And it's kind of like a pretty morbid work and job. But she does it because she likes doing it. She enjoys it. And so that's the only way she would be able to do it. I mean, otherwise it's just too much.
Yeah.
And the people who benefit from her work, they see that. So it actually works better. Basically, like, when you have someone who's there, who's waiting on you and helping you, if you know that they want to be there, like, the impact of their work is so much greater than someone who's just sort of doing it, right? So that's why it's kind of fuzzy, but I think people will know. People can hear it in your words. They can see it in your, like, complexion, like your personality, your tone, everything. It comes across. And so I think you can actually have a really positive impact if you keep doing that. A separate question would be like, yeah, how do I finance it? How do I, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why you may have other work you do that is different from that, which is, so
Yeah.
you kind of have to balance that. But yeah.
Got it. I think that's a really full and thorough discussion on this entire topic of sort of success,
It's a
skill sets.
really interesting topic for sure.
Yeah. I think moving on, I wanted to talk about writing just for a very brief moment.
Sure.
So you have taken Dave Burrell's
Yes.
course on rite of passage,
Of
and
course.
you know
Amazing.
that amazing essay, which I'll definitely link in the description, about why bother, and that was a fundamental essay,
Oh,
something
thank
that
you.
at least impacted me a lot, and I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask a few questions, and feel free to take the conversation in any direction.
Sure.
In context of skills, writing is not something that is easily quantifiable and is generally compared to, say, a technical skill, not considered rigorous or
Yep.
very
Yeah.
thorough.
Right.
So I'm curious to hear, how did you instill rigor in your writing, and how do you measure something that is inherently subjective? So
Yeah.
that's like the follow-up question to that. And I guess I'll also throw out the second question before you start answering, which is that, why do you think it is important for developers to write, and how could they write better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way that I would describe it is, I think first off, you want to measure the value of why it's worth writing for you. So I'm kind of answering the second question, but like the way that I measure how I'm writing and like how well I'm writing, let's say, is early on, especially like I'm an example. I'm not like famous or have a huge following or anything. So like right now, if I write something and it doesn't resonate, no one responds. Crickets, right? And so it's very clear. If I write something that does resonate, I get feedback, and that becomes clear. Now I don't change what I write based on that, but I ask the question, is this topic something that doesn't resonate, or is it the way I wrote it? And so there is some measurement that has to happen. You have to be able to tell based on how you've communicated an idea. And this is a fundamental skill. So I think the biggest thing that's really important, in note taking, like using tools like Roam Research, all these types of sort of tools that get your thoughts and put them down on paper. You're conducting this fundamental exercise of trying to take some idea or something you're saying and communicate it in a cohesive way that is compelling, and that maybe is told in a story format, maybe isn't, but is interesting enough to warrant attention. That is very hard. It is not easy. And so I think it's easy to get discouraged and sort of like be like, hey, I don't have a clear progressive way to know that I'm learning this skill set and that skill set about writing. But I think just by practicing and then testing and seeing how you're coming across, you can get better at it. And so I think you're right. There's no like quantitative specific thing for it. But I think one of the ways that you can do this is like see what the response actually is. So in my case, I really love it when people comment or reply in an email or something like that to a post, far more than like likes or what. Like I honestly don't care about likes. Likes don't tell me anything. They just tell you like, yeah, the topic is somewhat interesting, I guess. Yeah, obviously if it's a ton, then it resonated a bit. But when people say, oh, this connected with me because of X, then you understand that you were able to articulate it in such a way that that person read it for their own interpretation. And that's actually what's going to happen a lot. I remember I had a friend, he was writing a post, and he basically was talking about, he was overcoming some difficulties, like emotional and psychological difficulties. And he wrote this piece. And then someone messaged him and was like, wow, I loved how you talked about this and that and this and that. And he's like, I didn't talk about that. Dude, that's all you. And so I think that's really powerful writing, is where you're talking about yourself, but you write it in such a way that when someone sees it, they're like, that's me. He's talking about me. She's talking about me. I see that. And you connect with that. And I think you can measure that. I think you can measure it based on like the words that people say and how they connect with you. To your second question about developers, I drastically underestimated this for the majority of my career, I would say. And I only really started to realize this like later stage. But I think just communication in general is really important. So let's talk about why for a developer. So number one, like one of the things I always joke is like, if you ask a PM or a manager, hey, what are the skills that your developers should build? They'd be like, well, they need to be amazing writers. They need to learn how to draw diagrams, blah, blah, blah. It's like, of course, yeah, of course they're going to want that. But let's talk about an actual, you are the developer. What's your motivation, right? It's important to recognize that. So I always like to look at it as like, there's multiple sources. So one is frustration and the other is ambition. Okay, so let's talk about frustration.
Yeah.
So frustration is, you know, you're an engineer, you have great ideas about how the product can change. You have the context from working on it. You understand what's hard, what's easy. You get into a meeting room, you know, there's a discussion about this, a discussion about that. You say some stuff, people don't seem to get what you're saying. There's a back and forth, you lost them. Meeting's over. And you're frustrated because again, you feel like you have the right idea here. You just can't get it across. And that is super frustrating. It's like, it's very different than not knowing what the right thing to do is or not knowing what the right options are. It's like when you actually know that and you can't get that across, that is, it's pretty devastating. So I think writing can actually help train that muscle because you really have to condense it into a language that anyone reading it can understand and perceive.
Yeah.
So that's really important. And there's a bunch of examples around that, around frustration. Another one is around like, you know, like ambition. So let's say, you know, a lot of developers find themselves in big companies, you know, they're working on stuff they enjoy. They have ambitions. They want to work at a startup someday, or they maybe even want to found their own startup someday, right? Now, if you want to do that, you're going to need to shift your skill sets a fair bit. You can't just sit and focus on the codes and making sure on the code and making sure it's scalable and making sure that, you know, you're working within all these frameworks you've been working in. You now have to be able to like have quick conversations with people talking about product and shifting. You're getting, you know, going back to our polymath discussion, you need all these other skill sets. And I think like writing is the like foundational one because it basically gives you this like processing filter for your ideas as they're coming out. And you really have to be able to do that well in startups because there's just never enough people to always have all the ideas come from one place. And you know, you need to be able to like innovate on the spot and then just get buy-in from people quickly. And there's all these like tiny tactical skill sets that come with it. Like, you know, one of the things I found is like, if I had to convince a bunch of execs that we're going to go in this direction with a product at a big company, I would never try to do it in a meeting if possible. Like in a meeting, yes, I'm in person, I can use my presence, but it's sometimes I would find if I just wrote or made a little screencast video, which showed some really clear visuals, said a few simple things, you know, okay, now you have to critique that. You have to come up with a valid like objection to one part of that after having seen the whole thing. The problem with in-person meetings is like a lot of times people like feel like if you invite like a key executive into that meeting, they feel that they have to say something or else they're not contributing value. This is a real thing. And so, you know, they will inject comments as they go because they're commenting on one piece rather than the whole thing.
And also because they haven't seen the whole thing first.
They haven't seen the whole thing. And so then what happens? Then at the end of the meeting, it's like, well, the lead execs, you know, raised their hand like 2-3 times. You know, it felt kind of meh, right?
Because then humans are sort of emotional and they put rationality out of the window and they make decisions based on strictly their intuition and gut, which on other occasions may be correct. But in that particular occasion, when you're evaluating a particular idea, it may not be.
Right. I actually think that's exactly right. Because then they'll go away with this feeling that, you know, that didn't go very well. When actually it went really well. They presented a ton of information and there was only objections to a couple of things. Now, if you had written that, and people were seeing the whole thing, then, you know, I think it would be very different. And I think this is one of the things I see is a lot of times engineers have really foundational ideas and they just have no idea how to communicate it. And I think they can do that with writing. But at the same time, they can't just go and spew out like a 2,000 word thing. They have to know
Yeah.
how, all the tricks that we talk about.
Yeah.
How do you condense it? How do you make it interesting? How do you, add visuals, all these types of things. So I think it's really important.
Wow, I think that's beautifully explained. And just a sort of additional point over there, what you essentially said right now reminds me of what the executive coach of Mark Anderson, Venkatesh Rao, once wrote in a Quora answer. He said, you're either a thinker first or a writer first. And you have to clarify that distinction before you do any writing.
Can you elaborate on that? That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. He said that he uses writing as a tool for refining his thinking. So that is when he is a thinker first and a writer second. Other people can choose to be a writer first when you're just writing stuff because you want to create something. And then they can be thinker second because then you're reading your writing to refine your thinking.
That's really interesting. That's really fascinating. It makes me think, like, I feel like I can think of people who fall in these archetypes, right? Like we've all worked with them. And like, sometimes I actually think it also, it goes to the question of like, what do you think is the most valuable? Like the idea or the work that brings the idea to life, right? So a lot of times, for example, people are like, I have this great idea. I don't want to tell anyone. They'll steal my idea. That's what I used to happen a lot. I used to give these like startup idea talks and people would be like,
still happens today. Definitely.
I don't want to tell you my idea because someone's going to steal it. And I would always jump in. I'd be like, let's imagine this scenario. Imagine a scenario that you have a brilliant idea and someone else in this room hears it. And for the next 5 years, you do absolutely nothing about that idea. And someone else takes the idea, they turn it into a plan, they create a business out of it, they lost a business, they were successful in the business. You're telling me that you deserve all of their like reward? Like what planet do you live on? First of all, yeah, and mostly likely the idea doesn't have legs. The idea on its own doesn't mean anything. It's the execution. So going back to your analogy, I think that's the contrast. Is like some folks are like, I had the idea, that's it, done. It's over. Like the idea is great, it's there. Other people are like, I have the idea, but now I actually need to explain the idea, which means I need to bring it to reality in this world, and I need other people to be able to understand it. And that work is actually the important work. Like the idea itself is a tiny part of that, right? Like we all have.
It's like the genesis.
Right. It's like the genesis. And so that's a really interesting, I like that. Like a writer first is going to be the one that recognizes the importance of that work. And recognizes that, like, you might even measure your ideas based on that. So one idea, like, this is a great idea, but it's not grounded based on today. It's grounded on a potential infrastructure that we could have next year. That's one way. Another might be like, this is a good idea, but I just don't think it like easy to explain. It's not. And so it's like, that idea is not going to get very far. So it's a very different way of measuring the ideas.
Yeah, I think that sort of really, really wraps up this discussion on writing. I know we've run a little bit over time, but I'll just sort of quickly sneak in one last question that I sort of I'm beginning to ask every at the end of every interview, which is that, which is the one skill, activity, or habit that you would have optimized your life for starting much earlier and looking back in retrospect?
Picking one is hard, but I'll pick one and then mention the other. I mean, I would say meditation and journaling. So, meditation is, we could talk about this for a long time. I could definitely talk about this for a long time, but it's, people make it more mystical and difficult and complex than it is, but it really is just sitting alone with your thoughts and forcing yourself to be in that moment, which is just something in today's world that we just don't do. And so when you do that for extended period of time, there's compound benefits, all the stuff. But let's put that aside, because I feel like everyone knows that you should meditate and, but journaling, I think, is actually probably the one that's most interesting, because all the stuff we're talking about note-taking and writing and all that, if you sit down at a desk or wherever and you write down things that are on your mind, ideas that you have, like how you feel, gratitude for things every single day, like suddenly, your whole outlook changes, because now you appreciate what's happened. You become more present because you pay attention to the details of what's going on around you. You actually start to build ammo for your writing. So like a lot of people, they have all these ideas and they don't know how they're going to sit down and write from scratch. You know, David Perel talks about this is don't ever write from a blank page, write from abundance, right? What he means is like have a bunch of things that you've already written just sitting in front of you so that you can just edit, because we already have all those thoughts. So I think journaling is a really great way to start that habit, especially for people who don't write regularly. You can just journal and keep it private. And soon you'll find like, you know, oh, it was a few sentences. Oh, okay, I wrote a few paragraphs. And now you're like, hey, I'm like writing here, you know?
It's
So I
like a
think
digital garden that you are creating.
right. And it's yours. You can keep it to yourself, you know, and that way you don't feel, you know, intimidated or overwhelmed by, oh, I have to publish. Like, don't worry about it. Just write enough to yourself. I feel like, because then what's going to happen is you're going to convince yourself that you can write. And
Yeah.
you're honestly, you're the person that has to be convinced. It's no one else. Like no one else needs to be convinced. It's just you. So I wish I
Yeah.
had done that a long time ago. I mean, I used to write a little bit, but I didn't really understand the power of it until much, much later. You know, who knows what I would have written. But anyway, we don't look back. We just look forward. So yeah,
Yeah.
I hope anyone's listening, just give it a try. If, you know, journal some more, see what comes out, have fun with it.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering all of my questions. And I'm pretty sure this was extremely helpful, at least to me, from all the skills perspective, success perspective, you know, being a founder, writing, and this advice that you've shared. I'm sure that it has to be extremely, extremely useful for anyone who's just sort of looking to learn and just looking to optimize their life in meaningful ways.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a ton of fun. I'm glad we got to do it.